Yeah, thank you for including me in this very important project. As you just said, this is a war of aggression by the United States and Israel, and it is against the country of Iran. It is not only somehow against the regime or against, certain government officials. It is against the entire country, its people, its infrastructure, its institutions, its air, its water, its soil. This is a war against a livable future. And, I think listeners may already know this, but it bears repeating that the goals here on the part of the US and Israel, every day new evidence emerges that really undermines any possible illusion that the goals here have anything to do with women's rights or human rights. Um, we just found out that possibly the US and Israel intended to put Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in power as their client, which is incredibly cruel and twisted, just given the fact that he was the butcher of the Green Movement, the pro-democracy uprising in 2009, in which millions of Iranians took to the streets demanding free and fair elections. And so, given his record in crushing dissent, the fact that they would even consider turning him into an asset and putting him in charge really belies any pretense to this sort of like imperial feminist, whitewashing. I mean, I don't know that anyone really can take it seriously given the record of what the US has done in the region. So let's talk about their actual interests, right? If it's not about human rights, if it's not about democracy or women's rights, the US and Israel are hell-bent on dominating the entire region, supporting the right of Israel to be a Zionist settler colonial state, to achieve its goal of greater Israel, which involves, as we know, ethnic cleansing, genocide, occupation, war in southern Lebanon, annexation of land. And the US has supported this for decades, right? Because they see Israel as a bulwark against popular movements for self-determination, for ordinary people to have control over their resources, their lives, their land, and their priorities. And so, I think that the Islamic Republic is targeted because it disputes and disrupts this plan for Western imperial hegemony, right? That's how the Islamic Republic positions itself. And so, this war is a kind of it's a kind of dramatic enactment of a deadly fantasy that the US and Israel have had for almost 50 years, that they could use military force to topple the Iranian government. They want a regime in Tehran that will not object to their policies of genocide, occupation, war, that will go along with the suppression of other anti-imperialist and popular movements for democracy throughout the region. And that, of course, was what they had in Iran when the Shah was in power before the 1979 revolution. The Shah of Iran was another pillar upholding US and Israeli interests, another bulwark against popular movements for self-determination across the region, in Arab countries as well as within Iran itself. And so, this is about trying to maintain power. I really don't think it's a war about religion. I don't think it's a war about fighting terrorism. I think that the US and Israel prove again and again that when they wage war, they do so using the most brutal, violent tactics. They wage war against entire populations. And as I said, they wage war against the infrastructures, conditions, and resources that people need to live any kind of sustainable future life. Thank you for this question. This is one of the most difficult and challenging questions, I think. So to me, a feminist anti-imperialist solidarity begins from the feminist value placed on life, on flourishing, and on forms of freedom and justice that do not rest on religious, ethnic, gender, or sexual hierarchies. So feminism, as we know, feminism has many meanings, right? It's a concept that is much used and abused. For some people, it means more women in positions of power. For me, it means human liberation, right, from all forms of oppression. Feminist scholars and activists have long shown us, especially Iranian feminists, but feminists from the region as a whole, have long shown us how patriarchy, militarism, colonialism, and capitalism are deeply interrelated systems of power and domination, right? They use exploitation and violence. They use particular ideas about gender and sexuality. What are the correct, proper forms of gender and sexuality? What are the correct gender roles? And a kind of system of governance, right? That organizes itself around hierarchy and stratification to facilitate exploitation, right, for the people in power. So if feminism is about being against all of these systems, right, if it's about liberation, then you have to start from the question of what are the structural forces that are in the way of Iranian people achieving for themselves the kind of society that they want to have, right? More democratic, not based on maybe exploitation and hierarchy, where people would have equal rights, things like that. What are the structural forces in the way of the kind of flourishing that we would like to see, right? And so very quickly we find, and this is not only true of Iran, but we're talking about Iran, that there are many problems people face. It's not just one thing. And so the kind of feminist solidarity that I think we need is a feminist solidarity that is capacious enough to take into account all of the different forms of violence and exploitation and oppression that people are experiencing. So in Iran, a feminist anti-imperialism unequivocally opposes war and any outside aggression from foreign powers, especially those foreign powers like the US and Israel that are involved in genocide and colonialism. But we don't stop there because we don't look at society from above, through the eyes of a state, whether it's the Iranian state or any state, quite frankly. If we start from below, the conditions affecting people's lives, everyday lives, the conditions of people who are struggling to survive the devastation of war and the deprivations of maximum pressure economic sanctions, we quickly see that these forms of military and economic violence do not happen in a vacuum. So while we're condemning sanctions and war, we have to reckon with the strategies of accumulation and expropriation carried out by the Iranian ruling elite against the people, whether that is subsidy cuts, privatizations, corruption, price gouging, layoffs, unpaid wages, and on, that have contributed to the immiseration of ordinary people, while the elite have kind of managed to wrangle the sanctions regime as a kind of game they can play to protect and enrich themselves. So we have to talk about how the bombs, the US and Israeli bombs, fell on a population already reeling, right, from the massacre of untold thousands of protesters who took to the streets because they were pushed to the brink by currency devaluation and inflation. They were unsure about how they would continue to live, how they would continue to provide the necessities of life for themselves and their loved ones. So yes, of course, this overall economic situation is distorted and constrained by the imperialist policy of sanctions. But this is not enough to explain or account for the decisions that the Iranian government and ruling elite make, right? Their decisions to, siphon off resources for themselves and unleash violence against anyone who objects to this arrangement. So again, a feminist anti-imperialist solidarity has to oppose all forms of militarism and state violence. We have to oppose foreign aggression, as well as the mass arrests, the sham trials, the mass incarceration, torture, and executions. I think at least 32 executions since the start of the war that have been the Iranian government's main response to popular demands for wages, for bread, for freedom of expression, for democratic rights, for equality, and for dignity. And I think we have to support those legitimate demands and desires of ordinary people for self-determination, free from foreign intervention and authoritarian state rule. And I'll just end by saying that the reason I think these are core feminist values, I mean, just a few years ago with the Women Life Freedom Uprising, we really saw, I think, new idioms of revolutionary struggle emerge on the streets of Iran that were able to link demands for women's autonomy and equality with demands for a total reorganization of economic and social relations, right? That would actually prioritize the flourishing of ordinary people, giving people the things that they need to live a decent and good life. And I think in the process of that uprising, not only were concrete demands made on the state to, to get rid of the mandatory hijab law, but you also saw demands for transformations in the educational system, transformations in social relations, within the family, relating to each other as human beings, not through hierarchy, domination, and fear. Yes, I mean, so I don't want to speak on behalf of Feminist Virginia because I'm not as involved in the day-to-day organizing right now as I have been in the past. But networks like Feminist Virginia, which formed in solidarity with the Women Life Freedom, one of the things that they've been trying to do in this time is to really use social media platforms to do a couple of things. One is to offer an alternative to the kind of appropriation of feminism by the right wing, and to put forward a very clear anti-war feminist position that that rejects the binary, right, between having to choose one side or the other in this conflict, and that unequivocally stands on the side of ordinary people who have been fighting, struggling in different ways for a very long time to try to change their society from within on their own terms, right? So to reject that foreign aggression and intervention as profoundly anti-feminist. And so trying to put out a clear feminist politics in this moment, but also trying to translate voices from within Iran, the stories, the everyday experience. How are people surviving? How are feminists on the ground in Iran relating to this conflict, relating to the pro-monarchist, pro-war propaganda? How are feminists on the ground trying to have those hard conversations with people around them to challenge the hopelessness and despair that has been turned into a kind of weapon of war, right? And also to continue to uplift the voices and the struggles of people who are facing repression internally, right? Like, this is the challenge. Like, how do we take a clear position against execution of protesters without feeding into, well, because of the death penalty, they deserve to be bombed and invaded? Absolutely not. And actually, I don't think it's that hard of an argument to make. I mean, the United States has the death penalty and has mass incarceration and is one of the most brutal, has one of the most brutal prison systems in the world. And Israel is notorious for torturing prisoners, for sexual violence and torture against prisoners, for extrajudicial killings of Palestinians. Like, these are states, like the states that are trying to claim some kind of moral high ground against Iran are literally dripping in blood, are themselves the greatest war criminals, we've ever seen, right? So I don't think it's that hard to, I think we're almost too defensive sometimes, or too worried about, like, well, if we talk about repression in Iran, it's going to somehow sound like, Trump and Netanyahu. No, absolutely not. Trump and Netanyahu are war criminals. It's very clear. We are against the death penalty as feminists. We are against, mass incarceration as feminists. We support the right of everyone to, have freedom of expression, to publish articles as journalists without going to prison, to the right to carry out protests, civil disobedience on the streets. And also, we should, at some fundamental level, even in times of a carceral system, people should have a fair trial with actual lawyers and evidence and juries. So some of these basic things, are important to keep talking about. Even in times of war, we don't want to turn away and sort of abandon the people who have been on the front lines of trying to do the work on the ground to change Iranian society from within. And so opposing executions, opposing the mass incarceration, raising money for bail, even though there are sanctions and it can be very difficult, raising money to get people out of jail, raising money for people who have been recently released from jail, and doing things that we, things like that to try to actually support materially, politically, people on the ground so that we don't give in to despair. Actually, one thing that what you just said made me think of something I think is important to say, which is that, it's not the case that if we talk about political prisoners and demand fair trials or oppose the death penalty, it's not the case that Trump and Netanyahu are listening to us, the leftist anti-imperialists, and saying, oh, well, since they acknowledge that there's violence from the state in Iran, then we'll go and bomb them. Remember, let's go back to the reality. Their agenda has nothing to do with freedom or justice or being, in favor of rights for anybody. They are the people who bomb prisons, right? Israel bombed Evin prison. They are the people who, are committing mass murder. So I really don't think that we should be in a position where we have to worry that everything we say is somehow the cause, right, of this kind of right-wing co-optation. It's not. This is their propaganda. It's very easy to see through. It's very easy to tear that down, right? So in keeping with this whole theme about like having a feminist approach that begins with the conditions on the ground, the actual conditions that ordinary people face, what are the obstacles in the way to freedom? What are the different structural violences, domestic and foreign, that intertwine in their lives, right? I think in keeping with that kind of theme and approach, the thing I wanted to talk about is just that, to be against this war does not mean that you have to cheer for the Islamic Republic. And this is speaking to, as you said in the beginning, some people, on the global left, and I am very relieved. Don't get me wrong. I am profoundly relieved that the bombs stopped falling. I am profoundly relieved that Trump was not able to, quote unquote, obliterate Iran as he was threatening. To carry out genocide and war crimes. I am profoundly relieved that Trump did not get his way in Iran. And indeed, US imperialism is not all powerful. It is not a monolith that can just bulldoze its way around the world, accomplishing its agenda and imposing its will on the world. This is not true, and that is a good thing. In fact, US imperialism is facing major weaknesses and major rivals, right? But to acknowledge that does not mean to cheer on those rivals if they're also the executioners of our movements, of our peers, of our comrades, and their freedom dreams, right? So again, ordinary Iranians don't get to choose between bombs or bullets, between war or domestic repression. They have to face both at the same time, right? And the war is used to reinforce and justify internal repression in the name of national security. And internal repression is used as an excuse for war, right? So these structures of violence are not actually counterposed. They overlap or intersect in the lives of ordinary people, right? So imperialism and state repression are not opposing forces. They are locked in a twisted and deadly embrace that threatens the very possibility of a livable future for Iranians. And I want to emphasize that this is on every scale you can imagine, economically, ecologically. If you see the videos of the oil spills and the just absolute ecocide that this war has unleashed, bombing fuel depots, the amount of pollution and destruction, right, of the ecology, but also socially and politically, under conditions of war and repression and economic stress. What happens to people's relationships? What happens to their health, their mental health? If you can't imagine a future for yourself, how are you supposed to live, right? So against all odds, and even when it is not fitting with geopolitical pragmatism, I think we have to be on the side of liberation, of abolitionism and justice from below. And I know this can sound like some kind of empty, abstract slogan, but that's only because right now our movements in Iran have been crushed. But I believe that is temporary. I do not think this is the end of history. Iranian movements, popular struggle, they have faced major defeats internally and because of the war. But this is not the end of the story, right? So we can't abandon our ethics, our values, our principles, and what we know about history you know, because this moment is very dire and very bleak, right? We have to hold on to the idea that the unbearable conditions people are facing will produce resistance. You know, the Iranians are human beings. They have agency. And even though they are up against tremendous obstacles and violence, they have shown time and time again that the desire for freedom, the desire for a future that is livable, can be so powerful that it can defy all odds, actually, and it can bring new forms of struggle into being. We never could have predicted the feminist uprising that was women, life, freedom. We never could have predicted Iran would become the site of a new revolutionary feminist form of struggle, right? So we don't know the future. We don't know. But I think instead of cheering one side against the other, we have to have an ethical stance on the side of ordinary people. And this is necessary not only because we are committed to our principles and our values, but also to counter the right-wing pro-war and pro-monarchist propaganda that co-ops Iranian suffering, co-ops women's and human rights, and tries to discredit the anti-imperialist left as pro-regime. I mean, there is so much propaganda on the internet constantly bashing the left, as if everybody who's against the war is some kind of, pro-regime leftist. We have to fight again and again and again to carve out space for an anti-imperialist feminist approach, to fight that co-optation, to say we will never betray the popular aspirations for freedom, democracy, justice, for Iranians to have a say in their own future. The same values, the same things we would support anywhere else in the world, those hold true for Iranians too, right? Even and especially under conditions of war.